On February 5th, 2006, Ben Roethlisberger, otherwise known as Big Ben, became the youngest NFL quarterback in history to ever win a Super Bowl title. At just 23 years old, and in just his second NFL season, Big Ben led the Pittsburgh Steelers to a 21-10 victory over the Seattle Seahawks in Super Bowl 40. He would later go on to lead the Steelers to a second Super Bowl victory against the Arizona Cardinals just 3 years later in Super Bowl 43. Now, Roethlisberger wasn't just a good quarterback. He was one of the most prolific passers the NFL has ever seen. When he retired, he was ranked 5th all-time in NFL career passing yards, 8th all-time in touchdowns, 5th all-time in completions, and was one of just 6 quarterbacks in NFL history to have beaten every other team in the NFL. Now, Ben was known for playing outside the pocket. He called it like backyard ball, right? And it was kind of unorthodox, but it was the way he'd always played, and it seemed to always work up until Super Bowl 43. In that second Super Bowl matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, Big Ben experienced a crisis in the fourth quarter. Despite playing a good game for the first 3 quarters, the opposition came on strong late in the game. They scored 16 consecutive points unanswered, all but shutting down his little backyard style of football. And by now, they had taken the lead with just 2 minutes and 37 seconds remaining in the game. Look here, the fans had stopped cheering. And everybody, including Ben himself, began to wonder if the original game plan that hadn't seemed to be working for the entire second half was going to be good enough to finish the game in the fourth quarter. So commentators in the game began to blame Big Ben's peculiar way of playing for the lack of success he seemed to be having in the late stages of his game. But Ben, in the midst of his fourth quarter crisis, with questions looming, perhaps even in his own mind about his identity as a starting quarterback, he stuck to the game plan. With under 2 minutes to play, he marched the Steelers 78 yards down the field with a series of peculiar passes. And that culminated in him throwing this final outside the pocket, sidearm, game-winning touchdown pass to wide receiver Santonio Holmes with just 35 seconds remaining in the game. Ben finished strong in the fourth quarter of the game by holding fast to the statutes that had brought him this far. And when the time came for him to face the fourth quarter of his career, he did the same thing. Ben, who was already a Christian, he publicly rededicated his life to Christ a few years prior to retirement. And he credits his renewed focus on his faith with helping him to overcome some of the addictions that he'd wrestled with during his career. And when the time came to leave football altogether in 2022 and to transition from one life to the next, Ben did it with ease. So he now spends his time, I thought this was great, coaching for the Quaker Valley Youth Football Team. It's a team for 9 and 10-year-old boys. And he also leads a men's ministry at his church. And he does this to focus on building father-son relationships in the church. Look, football brought Ben Roethlisberger fame and fortune at a young age. But it was rediscovering his faith in the fourth quarter of his career and the fourth quarter of his life that completed him. So when we pick up this story here in a moment in Ecclesiastes, the writer is experiencing a similar fourth quarter crisis. Despite acquiring fame and fortune at an early age, he's wrestling with the faith of his youth. And he's trying to find fulfillment in the fourth quarter of his life. So today I'd like to speak to you from the topic, faith to finish in the fourth quarter. So, look, Ecclesiastes, if you have not already read it, can be a difficult book to study. So I'm going to start out for a little while here just giving some background on the book and its writer. And perhaps I might even share a little insight into how we might approach reading this often challenging book. Ecclesiastes. There's 66 books in the Bible. Ecclesiastes is the 21st book. And the title of the book comes from a Greek word that's really spelled the same way, just using K's instead of C's. And the title of the book, Ecclesiastes, it means the one who gathers together and teaches, the ecclesia, the assembly of the called. Now, many of us are familiar with this word ecclesia, but if you're not, here it is. The ecclesia is the church. It's the team Pastor Clark was just talking about, and that's us. It's who we are, right? We are the called out ones. And that doesn't mean that we're detached and separated from the world, but John 17 teaches us that though we are in the world, we're just not of the world. And while we're in the world, we're called to be salt and light. And the light of our good deeds should shine before others to glorify our Father in heaven. So the ecclesia is the church, and the Ecclesiastes is the one who assembles and speaks to the church. So the Ecclesiastes is like the pastor or the teacher or the preacher. Now, sometimes, we like to get up here and quote Hebrew and Greek just to look scholarly. I do it sometimes. But in this case, understanding the meaning of this title, of this book, it's pivotal. It's pivotal to understanding the rest of what's written in the book. So I want to just take a moment, because I think it's worth it, to pause right here at the title before we go any further and understand who's speaking and who they're speaking to. The title of this book is The Preacher. And as we consider this book, when you read it, when you hear what's written within it, keep in mind that it's not just anyone who's speaking. It's a preacher. So who is this preacher? Well, technically the book of Ecclesiastes is anonymous, but Jewish and Christian scholars all agree that the preacher or the teacher that's speaking in this book is Solomon. And this is a fair assumption for us to make as well, since verse 1 of chapter 1 describes this book as the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, if you have an ESV or a King James version, it'll say preacher. Your NIV will say teacher, but it's the same thing. It's the one who assembles and speaks to the church. And there's only one son of David that reigned as king in Jerusalem, and that was King Solomon. So, okay. So now we kind of know who's speaking, right? It's a preacher and a king. And Solomon is described, at the outset of this book, they describe him, right, as a preacher. And we're used to hearing preachers preach. But this book is not a sermon, at least not in the classic sense. It's more like a God-inspired journal of an old minister. Think of it like having a candid talk out back behind the church with one of the old deacons. You know what it's like? It's like sitting up late at night and having a conversation with one of your uncles over a cigar, one of your old uncles, and he's speaking based on his personal experience from the vantage point of his latter years. It reads like that. So Solomon is credited with writing 3 books in the Bible, and they don't all read like that. He's credited with writing Proverbs, the Ecclesiastes, and then, of course, Song of Solomon. And they appear in your Bible in that order. But context and study tell us that it's almost certain that that is not the order in which they were written. Even though they're right next to each other in the Bible, Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, when you look at both of these books, it's hard to imagine that the same person even wrote both books. And this is because scholars agree that Solomon likely wrote Proverbs very early in his life when he first became king. He wrote Proverbs, then Song of Solomon in the middle of his life. Makes sense based on the content. And then Ecclesiastes later in his life. And in fact, most scholars agree that Solomon couldn't have been more than 18 years old when he penned Proverbs. The scholar Josephus, the historian Josephus, says he could have been as young as 14 years old when he wrote Proverbs. So either way, it's safe to say that when he wrote the book of Proverbs, Solomon was very young. Far too young to understand anything about the things he was talking about in Proverbs. Okay. When he wrote Proverbs, he was young. He was wise, but that's just because he said exactly what God told him to say. Okay. But now in Ecclesiastes, he's older, and he's looking back, and he's trying to feel it. Okay, let's just take a minute here. Let me just pause for a minute, and let's just relate. Imagine you reading a book that you wrote giving advice to people on how to live life, but you wrote it 20 years ago? How about reading a book of advice you gave to people on how they should live their life 40 years ago? You might think a little differently about how you would share that advice. Okay, all right, look at it this way. How about this? Maybe some of you started something really important when you were really young. Maybe you got married when you were really young. Or maybe you had a baby, you became a mother or became a father when you were just a child yourself. Maybe you started your profession when you were really young, like a nurse or a doctor or a lawyer, trying important cases, doing surgeries, or starting a business when you were barely in your 20s. You started something big, but compared to where you are now, you were just a child when you started. Can you feel it? Okay. So you just did and said what wise people told you to do and say. Oh, perhaps some of the preachers in the room, they can recall starting their ministry, preaching God's word when you were just children. You said and you did what you knew to be wise, but it couldn't be heartfelt because your heart hadn't felt it yet. Okay, all right, stay with me. So such was the case for Solomon when he wrote Proverbs. Now look, we all love the book of Proverbs, right? It's recorded to be one of the most read books in the Bible. Probably because there's 31 chapters in Proverbs, normally 31 days in a week. It's perfect for a daily devotion, right? And the book of Proverbs, without question, it's filled with perfectly written divine wisdom. Remember, God granted Solomon a wise and discerning mind when he wrote it. So every verse spoken in Proverb is filled with like indisputable truths. And like many young preachers, he spoke these indisputable truths as a child. But as he looks back at this stage in his life, a lot of those early Proverbs sound more like platitudes. Y'all know this word platitudes? A platitude is like a lofty, like real general statement that's unquestionably true, but it's so obvious that it feels empty when you say it because it fails to acknowledge the lived life of the one who's hearing it. It's like a moral cliche. Y'all know y'all in church. Okay, watch this. Watch this. I'm going to try this. Let's do some call and response. Here go one of my favorites. God is good. And all the time. It's true, right? I mean, it's undisputably true. But if we're not careful, a platitude like this can lack substance and be difficult to grasp for people who are experiencing real life, particularly during times when life gives us hardship or suffering, and where goodness and the goodness of God might be a little difficult to perceive. If you're not careful, platitudes like that can drive people away from church instead of to church. So what are we talking about, Doc? Well, we're about to look at the book of Ecclesiastes, but before we do, we're trying to understand the writer, the preacher, and what he's experiencing after the sermon. Okay. As the characters and the chapters of Ecclesiastes unfold, we see that Solomon is experiencing a crisis of belief in the fourth quarter of his life. Despite his worldly success early on, he's now reached middle age and he's experiencing some serious emotional distress. He's struggling to find meaning in his life choices, in the randomness of the outcomes of those choices. He's wondering if it even matters. Many of us have experienced moments like these, and if you haven't, you might. Even those among us who have lived life to the fullest and experienced wild success, we still at times feel just kind of empty. In times like these, if we aren't careful, we can begin to doubt the significance of everything we have done in life so far. And after years of faithful, committed service, we can start to think about straying from the game plan because it all seems meaningless, like vanity. Solomon uses this word vanity 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. But when he uses this word vanity, he doesn't mean like the AKA Kappa Alpha Psi, look at me, I'm so beautiful type vanity. That's not what he's talking about. He don't mean that. He don't mean that. Shout out to the Divine Nine, no disrespect, but y'all know what I mean, right? Just saying. He doesn't mean vanity as in conceit. He doesn't mean vanity in the sense of pride in one's appearance. he means vanity in the sense of emptiness, like without substance. The Hebrew word here, is hevel. This is good. It means like a mist or a vapor. It's something that's fleeting or transient that you can't actually grab. And to be clear, Solomon he's not doubting the existence of God. He's wrestling with the question of whether or not God matters in my everyday life. Does it matter? Does God actually matter? And we all have wrestled with questions like this, even the preachers. Solomon has lived long enough to see people do the right things and still experience hardship, and then people do the wrong things, but everything still is a work out in their favor. I mean, come on. He's seen people who never smoke, eat healthy, serve God, and then they get cancer in their 50s, in their 40s. Then they die, and they leave behind like widows and parentless children. Or he's seen others, though, that smoke every day, a pack a day, and they smoke that other stuff on the weekends, too. Eat whatever they want, right? Drink every night. Haven't seen church since their mama dragged them there when they was a child. And then they live to be 90 years old, healthy as an ox. Some people study their whole lives, then work long, hard hours at work trying to earn a living. They obey the law. They show love to their neighbors. They tithe and they give to those around them, and yet they still struggle financially, can barely afford health care or the rising price of eggs. While others speak with shameful ignorance, are dishonest, barely work, are blatant, publicly convicted criminals, marginalized minorities, women and the underserved, and then they make $1 billion and get elected to the highest office in the land. It feels like vapor, like meaningless, like does God even matter? And so what does Solomon do with this? Well, Solomon does what a lot of people do when they experience a midlife crisis of belief. He starts to intentionally make bad choices. Oh, come on. Look at what he says there. He says something interesting in verse 17 of Ecclesiastes 1. He said, "And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly." What he's saying here, in the opening verses, if you read all of Ecclesiastes, in the opening verses, he made it clear. I tried doing it the right way. I tried doing what everybody said, and it still didn't work out. It's not working out for me. And so since it didn't work out doing things the right way, I'm finna start doing things the wrong way. I'm gonna start making all the wrong choices on purpose, and I'm gonna see if I can find some success in that. I don't know if you've ever been here. But this is what Solomon does. He chooses to look for satisfaction, for fulfillment, for happiness, for purpose in the world. Now, look, there's 3 ways that Solomon attempted to find satisfaction and purpose in life. And I'm going to run through them real quick, and then we can all go eat and watch the Eagles beat up on the Chiefs tonight, right? But, yeah, you know what's going to happen. But just listen to some of these, because God really spoke to me here, and I wonder if you can identify with any of these things that we sometimes choose to do because we've been doing the right thing and we feel like it didn't work out. Because, see, Solomon is warning us to watch out that doing these things in midlife or any point in your life will never bring you fulfillment. And it will always leave you feeling empty. And don't miss this. Look, like us, Solomon already knew that he shouldn't be living this way. Look, his father David told him in the 2nd chapter of 1 Kings before he died, make sure that you do what God said to do and follow his statutes. He told him clearly. And then God himself told him just when he became king, hey, look, make sure that you follow my statutes, do what I told you to do. He knew that. He preached it in Proverbs when he was young. But see, now he's saying something different. He concludes, if you read all the way to the end of Ecclesiastes, he concludes the same thing. He concludes the same thing God told him and the same thing his dad told him. You got to fear God. You got to follow his commandments. We all know that. We're here in church this morning. But now when he is saying it, he's no longer saying it just because God told him. He's saying it because he feels it in his heart because he tried it and it didn't work. And so he's trying to show you in the word. So this is so good. Look, so he said that. Look what it says here. What did he try first? The first thing he tried, there's 3 things he tried. He tried pleasure. He tried to measure. And then he tried to accumulate and store up treasure. as ways of finding purpose. And y'all don't do none of that, huh? Okay, so look at this. Look at the first one. He said, I said in my heart, I'm in verse 1 of chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. Look, he said, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it's mad. So what's he talking about here? He's saying the first type of pleasure that I tried was just laughter. And they call it in the Bible, they call it mirth. And maybe you know people like this. Everything is a joke. It's just all good. I'm laughing all the time. No matter what happens, I'm good. I'm chuckling. I'm telling jokes, right? Know these kind of folks. And so he did this, right? In Proverbs 17:22, it says, a joyful heart is good medicine. And we hear this quoted often. But in Proverbs 14 and 13, it says this is so good. Even in laughter, the heart may ache. And at the end of joy may be grief. Look, appearances can be deceiving. People may appear to be joyful, but they may actually be in really great pain. In fact, a number of really prominent comedians have publicly come forward to speak about deep sadness and depression. People like Dave Chappelle, y'all remember that? Or like I wrote down Jim Carrey, Eddie Murphy, and I know at least some of y'all have seen what's going on with T.I. Oh my God, y'all don't know what's going on with T.I., T.I.P.? Y'all know T.I., you know? Come on. You can have whatever you like. Y'all remember that guy? Well, look here. He a rapper, right? Y'all don't remember. Maybe I'm old. But look, this dude is 43 now, and he stopped rapping, and he's become a stand-up comedian. T.I. And look, if you go to the show, let me tell you, he's telling jokes and laughing, but ain't nobody else laughing. It's true. Nothing about what he's saying is funny. He is hurting. All he's talking about is his failures in life and the places where he has deep regret about everything, his marriage, his children, his career, all of it is heartbreaking. If you go, people just go to pay money to see him be heartbroken. Earthly happiness is fleeting. And rather than seeking laughter, Solomon is telling us that as a cure for our search for purpose, we should instead seek deeper spiritual joy, and that is found only in Christ Jesus. In John 15:11, Jesus says this, he says, I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. Laughter is not a cure for an unhappy life. But Jesus is, so what else did Solomon try? He tried other stuff. I love this next one. In verse 3, look at what he says in verse 3. He says, I searched with my heart on how to cheer my body with wine. He said, pour me some of that brown drink. I'm not feeling good. Look, and you can substitute whatever you want for wine. Any type of intoxicating chemical, drugs, even food. And he's saying, look, I love this in the verse. In the verse he says, and I kept my wisdom. So he's saying, even though I know that what I'm doing is wrong, I'm still doing it just to see if I can find some kind of satisfaction, some kind of escape from my pain. But he had preached this earlier in Proverbs 23 and 20 where he says, do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on too much meat. Proverbs 23 goes on to say, a wise person will not be among the drinkers of alcoholic beverages. Drunkenness causes poverty, woes, sorrow, fighting. And here's the worst part. When you sober up, all the issues that got you drinking, they're still there. Now look, Solomon is not saying to never have a drink. He's just saying that he tried it. And alcohol and liquor is not a cure for your lack of fulfillment. But Jesus is. In Matthew 26, at the Last Supper, Jesus invites us to drink the wine of redemption, which symbolizes his blood and forever seals our identity in him. Okay, so what other type of pleasures did Solomon try? Well, look, I like this in the B clause of verse 8. It says this, in the B clause he said, I got singers, both men and women. Now, look, this is like entertainment, right? He's like, I'm going to the show. I'm going out to see something. I'm going to catch a movie. I'm going to recreate. I'm going to travel. I'm going to the club. I'm going to go out and I'm going to party and forget about it. Anybody ever done that? Okay, just the bruh. None of these things are bad in and of themselves. There's nothing wrong with a little recreation. But in life, if we're not careful, we can start to think that recreation is the purpose. I'm just working for the weekend. Recreation is not our purpose in life. There's nothing wrong with going out to a nice restaurant and being served, but Matthew 20:28, Jesus tells us that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So recreation is fun, but remember, it's not your purpose. You are not working for the weekend. and it will not fulfill you. People think they're just working so they can save up enough to retire and relax on the beach for the rest of their life and do nothing. That's the dream. But it almost never works out like that. That's not the case. And it wasn't the case for Solomon either, and so he's warning us. Look, and here's why. In John 13, we find Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And in verse 14, he says this, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you." We were created to worship God and to serve. And fulfillment is found when we're walking in our created purpose. Now look, I added this for the men's ministry, and I'm not going to go too deep on it, but there's also a commentary in this verse about porn. So he talks here about finding concubines, the delight of the Son of Men. And he's not talking about relationships. He's talking about sex as recreation, recreational sexuality. And I ain't going to dig into it too deep, but I'm going to tell you that recreational sex will never be fulfillment in your life. Just ask your boy P. Diddy. Okay, well, I'm going to keep it moving. He goes on. He goes on in verse 10. Hey, look, he was looking. Okay, he goes on. I'm not going to touch it. Men's ministry, come out. We talk about it again. In verse 10, look at what he says in verse 10. He says, "And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them." Now, you know, in the theme of sexuality, we think about that, right? But Solomon is also talking about something that punched me right in the chest. Whatever my eyes desired, I didn't keep from them. So he's talking about materialism. He's talking about consumerism. Look, this is what he's saying. He's saying, I wanted to feel better about myself, so I bought stuff. Okay. I bought stuff to make me feel better and to make people feel better about me. Okay, what kind of stuff? Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Dior, Versace, Gucci, Prada, Ferragamo, Balenciaga, Dolce & Gabbana. Okay, I'm not in your neighborhood. Rolex, Cartier, Armani, where the fellas at? Hermes, Jordans, where we at? How about the cars? Bentleys, Maseratis, Porsche, BMW, you name it. He was buying things not because he needed them. He was buying things because he felt like they said something about his identity. They made him feel like somebody. We have a term for this. We call it conspicuous consumption. We don't just buy stuff, but we buy stuff and then we got to actively display what we bought so everybody can see how much it costs. Let me put the tag out. Hold on, I think I still got the tag on my jean. Put the tag out. You need to know what kind of jean it is. I need you to know. Look, we need you to know that we bought expensive clothing. You got to know that the car is an expensive car. It's an expensive purse. And we start young. Oh, we start real young. I was telling the men, look, 3.1%, 3% of the world's children live in the United States. But over 40% of the world's toys are bought and owned by children in the United States. We teach our children early that things are a conduit for happiness. But our identity is not found in things. It's found in Jesus. John chapter 1, verse 12, they tell us that Jesus said, whoever receives him, those who believe in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. We are his, and we don't need stuff to prove it. But he goes on in verse 10, right? He says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. And this right here, this is about sex and promiscuity. Solomon, we know Solomon, right? Solomon didn't just collect stuff, he collected women. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3 tells us that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Back hurt right now. This is adult church. But look at this. We were talking about this in men's ministry. Think about this. With 1,000 women, he could have physical intimacy with one every night and then never speak to that person again for 3 years. And so in his quest to find fulfillment in physical intimacy, he actually forfeited the idea of emotional intimacy and the safety and the love that's found in long-term committed emotional relationships. He was ducking it by having a lot on the deck. Okay, all right. I wasn't born 50 years old. Okay, so I'm going to keep it going. So like Solomon, we often look to unhealthy sexual relationships to fill the void in the midst of a crisis. We run to the arms of somebody warm. Solomon wasn't the only one who wrestled with this temptation. If you remember, his father David before him had a similar problem with his mama Bathsheba. And before you start judging these brothers, I need you to remember this. Solomon was a preacher. This was a chosen man of God. And his father before him, he was considered a man after God's own heart. So what am I saying? I'm saying if it happened to them, it could definitely happen to you. And so before you look to find rest in the arms of a lover in the midst of your midlife crisis, remember what Jesus said in Matthew 11. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." In verse 10, I love this. I'm going to keep it moving because some of these might touch you. Here's another one. In the B clause of verse 10, he said, "For my heart found pleasure in all my toil." And I know my fellows can feel this. Solomon, like many men, just sought purpose in his work. I'm just going steady grinding. I'm going to try to make the next promotion, get the next thing, get the next certificate. I'm at work. I'm grinding. And he found this also to be unfulfilling. Okay, so Solomon tried pleasure. I'm going to move to some of these quickly. So what did he try aside from pleasure? Well, he tried to measure. Solomon tried measuring up by having accomplishments. And I thought this was great. He talks about in verses 4 through 8, all the things he did, all the things he built, all the diplomas he's got on the wall, the certificates he's had. I'm going to accomplish things and find purpose in that. And he found that none of those things brought fulfillment. You'll never find fulfillment when you place your fulfillment in what you're doing rather than who God is. This is great. So Ben Roethlisberger, I was looking at all these little sermonettes that he did, right? I want to see if I can copy something from what Ben did. I can preach, right? None of his stuff was that good, though. But anyway, so I listened to him, right? And this is what he said. This was good. They asked him, they said, "Ben, you play 18 years, multiple Super Bowl winner, MVP. Why didn't you try to be a commentator? Why didn't you try to stay close to football in that way?" And he said this. It was so good. He said, "I was only good because God made me good." So rather than chasing more success, I want to chase the one who gave me success. Oh, that was so good. He said, "I'm going to find fulfillment not in what I do, but in who God is." In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 4, I spent like a week right here. This was so good. This is because I know I got some other haters in the room. I know y'all ain't going to admit to being haters, but look at what he said. He said, in 4, he said, "Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor." He's saying, I'm only grinding because I'm trying to be better than him. Oh, he got that Mercedes. I know you got that Mercedes show. I got to get something better. Okay, nobody feels me on that. No haters but me. But this is what he said. He said, look, I found that people are grinding and working to find purpose in being better than the neighbors. And he found that this was empty. You can never find fulfillment in outdoing people that are around you. He also said this was great. Many of us, this is a new thing, maybe the younger folks can relate to this. People try to find meaning in legacy. I want to build something that's here when I'm gone and that lasts for all time. I want to start something that has long-lasting implications. But in verse 11 of chapter 1, he said, there's no remembrance of the former things. Hey, look, spoiler, ain't nobody going to remember. They ain't going to be thinking about you. I said, you know what? I said, I'm going to go get me a Ben Roethlisberger jersey to wear on Sunday. I mean, he just retired in 2022. They're like, we don't carry them old school jerseys. Nobody had a Ben Roethlisberger jersey. Nobody remembers. Okay, there's no legacy. So he's saying if you're building legacy without God, it's pointless. It's okay. So I've been before you a while. Look, I'm going to close on this last one, so please feel free to join me in standing all over the room. But this last one is really good. He said, the last way in which we often seek fulfillment is in storing up treasure. Trying to get some chips, trying to put some cash away, trying to make some money, trying to make some green. I'm trying to get paid. So Solomon said, look, I'm going to find fulfillment and purpose and happiness and joy in my money, in building wealth. And so he said this in verse 8. He says, I gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. But Jesus spoke directly to this in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, when he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay for yourselves treasures in heaven. And this is the verse that pricked me. He said, for where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Now, I've read this verse many times over the years. Perhaps you've heard it many, many times. But as I considered it this time, from Solomon's perspective today, I can see clearly that no matter how much we love God, how long we've served him, when our treasure is here on earth, when the things that we value are natural things, it doesn't matter how much our lips praise him, our hearts will be far from God. And the direction of our lives will follow our hearts away from God. And so, if you find yourself today in a fourth quarter crisis or moving in a direction that takes you away from the things that truly matter, I invite you to pray today, but not to pray to ask God to grant you wisdom, but rather to pray to ask God to come in and to change your heart. Amen. Thank you for listening.